Hello. Back again with some more bagging and boarding that needs to get done. So I thought I'd just rap with y'all about stuff. I'm gonna be bagging and boarding for quite a while now, or for quite a while here. I'm not gonna be going rambling on the entire time. I don't have enough stuff to talk about. This is so we can. This is this is what needs bagged and boarded. Um, I know there are exactly 157 issues in here that need to get bagged and boarded. I know that because I know what it is. Um, it is a full run of Marvel Team Up. Um, some of these just might need retaped. That's not too bad. Marvel Team Up, which was 150 issues and 7 annuals. So there are 157 issues in here. But yeah, some may be okay. Some may not. So yeah, I picked up a run of this. And with getting a full run of Spider-Man, 99% of Marvel Team Up is Spider-Man and somebody. So I figured that was it. Came across an auction that had the full run. I did some math to figure out if it would be worth it just to buy it all at once, or to try to cobble it together like I've done with other things. Taking and also considering how much easier it is to it's easier to just buy things, complete. Obviously, it does take some of the fun away. There is a bit of entertainment with the hey, I completed it. Yes, you don't get that when you're buying individual issues. You don't get as much. You discern as much on individual issues. Like, oh, I don't like that copy. I want a better copy or something. But I went through a lot of, and then a big thing is cost. Is it going to be cheaper if I just try to cobble this together myself? So I weighed a number of things. I still have all the calculations that I did for that. I might make a video on that as well as how I decided to go ahead and what price, what bid I decided to put on this. That I thought it was a good bid, that was worth just buying it all outright. So I might do a video on that. I don't know. Who knows? But anyway, while I get started here, the thing that I thought I'd kind of ramble about is time. Not real time, not our time, not human time, but time in comics. This obviously specifically becomes a problem in certain cases, specifically in those where there is a long-running universe. Obviously, the biggest offenders of this is Marvel and DC. What happens? How do you take into account? I don't know. These boards look. Yeah, I guess they're fine. These bags are fine. They're single taped and I like to double tape things, so I'll just double tape them. How do you account for that? How do you account for when these characters were created in the 40s, 50s, 60s, depending. Probably didn't think it would be an issue. Like, is this going to matter? Are these characters going to be around in 10, 20? Definitely not, 50, 60 years later. Never would have thought. But then it happened. They became actually popular, and it turns out that people generally speaking, at least in the superhero world, like to have the same old characters forever, and don't have them being retired. Which you can't blame the companies for being well, if that's where they want the money. If that's where the money is, that's where we're going to put the money. So how do you handle the passage of time? Interestingly enough, there is not one correct answer. Marvel and DC both decided to do this in different ways. DC probably more infamously with their continuing crises in universe reboots. Your Crisis on Infinite Earths, your new 52s, and so on. So, if Superman was, let's say, in his 20s, in the 40s, he would be super old. He would be math amount of years old. Do the math. A lot. And generally, I think people aren't interested in following the adventures of a geriatric Superman. Or at least, well, actually, I'd be super interested in that. But not as, like, the main Superman. So how's that to be handled? When, like, Superman would probably be about 50 years old. We want someone who's a bit younger, closer to the demographic, and I don't know, whatever they decided to do, or reasons they had in the, these are in good shape, in the 80s for Crisis on Infinite Earths. Well, I mean, reboot. Which in of itself, interestingly enough, like a reboot is becomes its own sort of character, right? Because it's never just been we're starting fresh. Here is a retelling of the origin, or you have the general gist of the origin. We're just kind of taking off, however they decide to do it. They've done reboots a number of times in different ways. But it itself creates another universe, right? So that's where we have Earth 2, the Golden Age superheroes, and we have the Silver Age superheroes, not the same as the superhero, the Superman in the books you read today. It's literally a different person, just from a different universe, and that's kind of fun. I do enjoy alternate reality, even though I guess it's not really alternate reality because it was the reality, right? So what's kind of weird about that is that it's never the same. It's never the same Earth. But it makes for some interesting stories. Like, oh, hey, I love it when Golden Age Superman shows up, Earth 2 Superman, or whoever, or old JSA characters and whatnot. It makes for really fun stories to happen every once in a while. Then you get weird things where there's alternate Earth 2s, right? Because like the New 52 had an Earth 2 book, which wasn't really the Earth 2. Like I don't know how they resolved that. Earth 2A, Earth 2B, or whatever they did. I don't know. So it can have for some fun stories. The other side of that sword, of course, is that things get real murky. About like what is going on when some of these characters show up, and for people who don't necessarily like read a bunch of DC, don't know about that, or casual readers, I imagine it really throws them off. Maybe not enough to like stop reading or seriously affect sales or anything like that, but the DC universe as a whole is very complicated because of these reboots, these crises, these erasing of timelines and universes and merging of timelines and universes, and it's oh man, this is gonna be good. Marvel team up. Aunt May and Franklin Richards. Oh boy. It's a real complicated universe to really be able to dive into. And I think that shuts off a lot of that content for some people. Like there's a chunk of the DC universe that is just not for some people. because it takes either having the knowledge or having to go get the knowledge, which on its own is very difficult. Like, where do you go? Like, you can go to a Wikipedia page and, you know, read about stuff or whatever. It still is gonna be pretty confusing. You can try to read all of it. Even then, it's confusing. If you can get your hands on the stuff to read. But at the same time, like, why bother? Like, why bother, you know, why do I need to invest all of this time and money into learning about a universe that basically no longer counts? Seems weird. But it can be done. You know, I'm in no way, you know, a pro when it comes to that sort of thing, the DC multiverse. I know enough to get by and that I can enjoy some stuff, but it may not be for everyone. But it is a way to do things. I needed this. It's tied for the. I guess if it's a side, this is going to go on my key issues. Tied for the first appearance of the black costume, or wearing the black costume, or whatever. I don't know. It's a pretty nice shape too. Happy with that. What was I talking about? Oh yeah, so that's one way to do it. And the other problem with that is that when you do a reboot, I mean, you are for a lot of people invalidating. What size bags were these? They're like in between current and silver. Put replacements in silver. Like all these stories that they loved while they were reading the current universe, you know, and when the first crisis came down, I was like, whoa, wait a second. I was so invested in everything that went on, and now it just doesn't count. Like, what? You know, the characters are still around, so they still went through that, but some of those events like didn't actually happen in what it would then, you know, after post-crisis, post-reboot, be considered the DC universe, the main universe. And that's kind of a kick, you know. I love this stuff. I love these stories, but now all of a sudden they just don't matter because. So there's ups and downs. I feel that's the reboot thing. Also, you know, when a reboot happens, and the reboot sucks. You know, your New 52s, where, you know, there were some good stories in there. There's some good characters. The reboots I was, you know, okay with, but on the whole, and I think this is the general consensus, is that the New 52 version of the universe was not great. They tried to change it up too much. It was a little too much shaken up. And then, I don't know what they do, how they fix that. I don't really, I don't even know. I read it and I don't even know how that all got resolved. Because it's like, it's still kind of the New 52, but it's not. I read Green Arrow and, like, you know, in the New 52 in that reboot, I think it's a New 52, where like he would be like, oh, he's just young again. He's young, sort of hip playboy Green Arrow. But it's like, it's still that same Green Arrow, but he's not young anymore. Or at least he looks back to when he was older. I don't know, because it's too much. Like when it was just the one crisis. All right, we got our Earth. You know, one. We got Earth Prime. We got our Earth 2. We got, I don't know, Earth 0 or what. Like, and when it was just one, even that was confusing enough. But now after how many reboots, it's like, oh, geez, how do you keep it straight? Like you could write a whole book on this is the history of the overall DCU, and it's to me it's too much. In that, being said that I do enjoy multiverse crossover stories. I don't know if it's worth it. I don't know if those occasional stories are worth all of the confusion. But that's my opinion. It certainly is a valid way to approach the problem. Another valid way, what Marvel did. Oh, and I also wanted to mention, so if a reboot is not good, I suppose that formula is the problem's own solution, and that they can just reboot again. Like, oh, this reboot was bad. Guess what? Another reboot to put it back to being fixed. Anyway, the way that Marvel does it, is that they just don't care. They do not care. It's not a thing. They don't worry about it. It's an unmentioned thing. Time just goes. Things are different. They're never really mentioned. It's just, a big problem for that is, you think of like characters like the Punisher, right? The Punisher, in his origins, was a soldier in Vietnam. Well, if he was a soldier in Vietnam, he'd be getting up there in years. Probably too old to be running around as a vigilante like he does today. How do you handle it? He is tied to a specific point in known history. The Vietnam War took place in, I'm bad at history, 70s something. That is a fact. They introduced a war that exists in reality into this fictional universe, and it took place at a time. And they tied a character directly to it. Now, this isn't the first time. Obviously, Captain America has a similar thing where he is tied to World War II. Bucky is tied to World War II, but they lucked out on that one. They can always be tied. Oh, man. Well, the 1 and the 2 definitely need to be replaced. But I think I kind of knew that going in. It's okay. I got it. I got some reader copies. Because Captain America was frozen. How long was he frozen? Until he was thawed out. He is put in a time capsule. Same with Bucky. They got away with it, but that's because of their story, their actual story. Like, he was frozen in a block of ice. When was he unfrozen? Was it in the 1960s? Was it in the 70s, 80s, 90s? Was it yesterday? It doesn't matter. He was unfrozen from when he was frozen in World War II until that point. It's fine. It doesn't matter. But Frank Castle was in active duty during the Vietnam War. So how do you handle that? Well, you don't. You don't handle it. You just ignore it. You don't reboot the universe because the Punisher no longer makes sense, or a handful of characters no longer make sense. You just let it go. Now, that's not to say that he was still a soldier in the Vietnam War. You can't do that. But you just... No. Punisher was in Desert Storm. He was in Desert Storm. And then you move along, whatever, there's always going to be another... He was over fighting ISIS. There's always going to be some place for him to have been active military, right? It's okay. It doesn't change him. It doesn't change his story. And it doesn't change his adventures. They all still happened. They all still happen. Now, it gets to be a little bit like, well, I'll come to that a bit later. But I mean, that's how you kind of get around some of those things of time when it comes to characters being tied to a specific thing. There's either you work it into their story, or you just manipulate it without really saying anything. Frank Castle wasn't in Vietnam. Are you kidding? He wasn't even born yet. How could he be? And the same goes for everything else. Like, it's just Peter Parker as Spider-Man, or Spider-Man's adventures, didn't happen in the 60s. Those stories came out in the 60s, but as far as our time is concerned, they could have happened 5 years ago. They're not tied, for the most part, to specific things. It's just kind of hand-waving. Yeah, that happened. You know, if you read Spider-Man books, or, X-Men books, and so on, they will refer to things that happened in their early years, because they still happened. They didn't happen in 1960 whatever, but they happened. So history is not erased. These stories that made the characters and defined the characters still happened. No one's upset. For the trade-off there is, okay, I have to suspend my disbelief about how time works in this universe where Thor is a literal being. Asgard is literally real. If I can suspend my disbelief for that, I think I can suspend my disbelief for time works a bit different. Everything still happened. Don't worry about it. Stories are what the stories are. Why were they dressed in bell bottoms and high collars? They weren't. It's okay. The stuff still happened. Personally, I think that is the better way to do it. Just ignore it. Just don't worry about it. DC, again, it's trade-offs, right? I love me some multiverse crossover stuff in DC. I love it. It is fun. But it is if I have to deal with this super complex universe and these constant reboots, at least I get this. At least I get this. But it's definitely, in my opinion, not worth it. I feel Wolverine's claws are a bit exaggerated there. That's too much. It's too much. Yeah. Stuff happened. Don't worry about it. You're reading about a world of superheroes and magic and all this stuff. Time works a bit different. So it's okay. It's all okay. There's something else I was gonna. Oh, time is. It's not. Comics isn't the only one with the problem of time. I should say. What comes along with the advancement of time. Right, as technology changes, it affects stories that can be told and how they are told. And for some, it's problematic. For example, horror movies. I greatly enjoy horror movies. old horror movies, bad horror movies, good horror movies, current horror movies. Good stuff. With the invention of, and the fact that in everyone's pocket is a cell phone, completely changes the dynamic of horror movies. Completely changes it. Like, you think about horror movies from 60s, 70s, 80s, or, you know, you think of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Halloween, or any of that stuff. Those stories couldn't exist how they were if there were cell phones around. Hello, there's someone trying to kill me. Please come save me. Click. Don't go in there. There is a murderer. Click. You know, if phones still clicked, but you get the idea. So they are significantly different now. You can't tell the same kinds of stories that were told before the proliferation of the cell phone, which is too bad. At least you can't do it today. That is, if it takes place in the modern time, which is why I think, you know, we see a lot of horror movies nowadays. Yeah, a lot of them. I'm not going to say most of them. I'm not going to go out there, but I'll say a lot of them. A significant amount of them take place in the past. You know, so like It Follows was a great horror movie, but it took place in the 80s because it had to take place in the 80s, because if there were cell phones around, that it's just doesn't matter as much. Stranger Things, right? It takes place in the 80s, and I think for that it's more of a stylistic reason. But at the same time, that would be a lot different show if cell phones were around in that time. They'd have to write around it in some way. Need more tape. So a lot of current horror movies or new horror movies today, either they take place in the past or remote locations where people do not get cell service. And keep an eye out for it, because you'll notice it. You'll notice it if you watch horror movies, or just like movies in general, where it's important to not, where that technology would completely blow away the entire point of the story. They make a point to say, "There's no service. There's no service." How many movies like that have to explicitly state there's no service? Because otherwise, you'd be like, "Why aren't you just using your cell phone to get out of that ridiculous situation?" Oh, because it's 1980 or we are in the mountains. Yeah, sometimes it's a funny thing. It's a funny thing. Well, I'm nowhere near done. Nowhere near done. But that's pretty much it. That's pretty much all I had to talk about. Just something I've been thinking about for a little while now. Thought it'd be fun to chat. Would like to get, what are your thoughts on that? Do you prefer the way that DC does the time thing with the reboots? Are you into the reboots in general? What do you think? Or do you like the Marvel way of just ignoring it and going with the flow and saying, deal with it? It's the way that it is. Or any other thoughts that you have, or do you have any other ideas of how that could be handled, in other ways? I'd be interested to chat about that. So that's it. Let me know. Like, comment, subscribe. Have a good day. All that. I'm going to be here for another few hours, I'm sure. No, not a few hours, but I'm going to be here for a little while. But that's it. Hope you have a good day. This video was brought to you by Titan Comic Pressing. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Titan Comic Pressing LLC.